Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing great today, because I'm excited to welcome you to our second edition of our camp. The previous one took place last spring, and after a summer break, we are back with Angular Autumn Camp. This series includes 3 meetups when you will hear from some of the best experts in the Angular world. My name is Krzysztof Skorupka, and I have the real pleasure of being your host for today's event, proudly representing Angular.love community who put together this awesome series. We are live streaming from Warsaw, Poland, but we are really curious to know from which city you are watching us, so be sure to let us know in the comment. At this point, I would also like to thank our sponsor, House of Angular, whose support makes these meetups possible. House of Angular is a software agency specializing, in all things Angular. So if you have any challenges in this area, feel free to reach. And we are also really grateful to our partner, Pact, for providing the books that you can win in the Kahoot game at the very end of the event. And as for today's agenda, we have 3 amazing presentations awaiting us. First, will be presented by David Kostka, and will be about why is my app loading slowly on 3G internet. Then we'll have Mateusz Stefańczyk diving into custom features in NGRX Signal Store. And after that, we'll have a short break. And last, but definitely not least, Manfred Steyer will dive into vertical architectures for scalable Angular applications. After each section, there will be also a Q&A panel, so don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat. Additionally, during the break and after the last prelection, there will be also remote networking possibility set up via Google Meet. So for our online participants, be sure to join. Yeah, so that's quite a lot of information, I know. So without further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, David Kostka, who is a passionate developer at House of Angular. Actually, it's David's second appearance at our Angular meetups. Last year, you could hear from him about Angular signals, and today he will discuss why is my app loading slowly on 3G internet. So let's welcome David to the stage with a round of applause.
I would like to start this presentation with a rhetorical question. Have you ever tried to optimize your enterprise application, especially the loading time? I guess that many of you here may have not. As the developers, we are often pushed to deliver the features as quickly as possible, and therefore the optimizations in our applications often goes aside. Today we are going to talk about how easily we can optimize our initial load and why this may be important. Okay. So let's start. I'm David Kostka, an Angular.love blogger and bundle size enthusiast. As I am often on the go, I usually travel by train, which have one cost. Although I love the possibility of doing something during the travel, this often is interrupted by unstable network connection. I'm sure that all of you have ever experienced that. Maybe some applications have been taking forever to load, and as a result, you are staring at the laptop or smartphone screen for around 10 or maybe 30 seconds. This is especially too long, and in my opinion, we should optimize our applications so they load really fast. So firstly, let's think what makes our applications load fast. In my opinion, before optimizing any things in our apps, we should firstly understand what may go wrong. So, to mimic the poor network conditions, you have to firstly set up your DevTools correctly. Make sure that you will go to the network tab and disable the cache with enable the 3G throttling. After you do it, go to the Performance tab and click that magic refresh button. After around 20 to 60 seconds, you should be able to see a waterfall chart describing how your application has been loaded. Note, if you see that for the first time, it may seem really complex, but believe me, it is really simple. All of these lines here that you can see describe a particular resource that have been loaded at some point in our website. So, although these are many lines here, I would like to break this down into 3 different stages. The first one of them will be loading our HTML document, which is the core of our website. After we fetch it, we usually dispatch some other requests, for example, for our JavaScript, CSS, and font files. Once this step is done, we usually fetch some external data from the APIs. At this step, we also fetch some images. But in my opinion, the first stage of loading your data is not that important as the first 2 stages. At this point, you can already display some loading spinners and skeletons to your users, so they know that you have to still wait for just a couple of things to load. Unfortunately, this is not the case in the first 2 stages, which usually are render blocking, especially if you're working on a client-side rendered application. Just because of that the client application is rendered on the client side, the users will see a blank screen until the application will fully load. So let's think how we can optimize that. In my opinion, the first step would be to take a lighthouse check of your application. This one often will highlight many problems in it that you can optimize. But unfortunately, after you implement them, you will find that the lighthouse report often lacks many specific solutions how you can optimize your website. So for example, it will say things like you're loading too many JavaScript, but it won't tell you how easily you can decrease its amount. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about 3 main things, which in my opinion are really important to speed up your website. First one of them is going to be the server infrastructure, which stands at the core of every website optimization. Then we'll move on to optimizing font load, which in my opinion is also really important. Lastly, we're going to discuss how we can ship less JavaScript into our applications, just because the JavaScript is the largest resource in our websites. So let's get started with something that is not directly related to the code we write, the server infrastructure. In my opinion, any other optimization changes won't make much sense in case you have a poor infrastructure. First thing that you should consider doing is implementing a compression format in your application. This one can decrease the text file size during the transfer by up to 80%, which will already give you a huge boost to initial loading. Just by implementing that, your lighthouse score may be increased from 40 to 100, and believe me, this one really makes a difference. For the algorithms that you can implement on your website, you can use either ZSTD, Broadly, or gzip. Just make sure that you're using the one that fits your website the best. Sometimes we may also think about not loading the individual files again and again. This is possible thanks to the caching. This mechanism is really important just because our users don't have to load the same files over again. Note that this is possible thanks to the hashes that Angular appends to our files during the build process. You can see them right here, and they are unique on every different build of our Angular application. So thanks to that little feature, you can cache your JS and CSS files for up to 1 year, which is surely going to last you until the next release. But even those 2 steps are not that important in case you're targeting a global audience. In such cases, using a CDN, in my opinion, is a crucial thing. This one will make your website load fast will make your website load fast in Japan as fast as it is loading in the United States. This is really important, especially if you target a global audience. So let's finish that DevOps stuff because I am not the best person in it. And now let's think about something that we, as the front-end developers, can do to optimize our websites. First thing that you should not be doing is using a font display block property in your application. As you can see right here, this will make your application the content in your application initially invisible just because your font that is at the top haven't been loaded yet. And as a result, in my opinion, even in case you have a fast application that uses the SSR or pre-rendering, it will feel slow just because you're using that little property. Fortunately, it is really easy to fix. You can do it by implementing the font display swap property, which makes your text initially visible just by displaying it with the fallback font. Although this can introduce some cumulative layout shift into your application, in my opinion, seeing some content is better than seeing your content with the custom font. Believe me or not, but this really can make a difference, and 2.5 seconds on the mobile internet connection is a really long time. But of course, optimizing our fonts is not just about the typography fonts. Often we are using the icon fonts in our applications, and these ones have often a really big problem. Just because we are using a few icons in our application, we are often loading them all at once. This can result in a very slow rendering, which is really poor, which can provide our users with a really poor experience, especially if you're using the icon buttons in our application. The icons are often rendered really slowly just because they often wait too much. So for example, the Google Material symbols can't wait as much as 3.2 megabytes. Believe me or not, but this is a really big amount. Fortunately, other kits are much more optimized. So for example, the font awesome kit will wait around 100 to 200 kilobytes. But in my opinion, this is still a really big number, especially if we compare it to the two packages that you're likely using in your Angular application. Guess what they are? The Angular core and Angular router. These include a lot of the code, which still weighs around 160 kilobytes unzipped. As you can see here, this one is still less than the icons that you're loading into your application. So in my opinion, this is really crucial. So instead of using the font icons, that you should be using the SVG images instead. But as you may imagine, this often does not provide the greatest developer experience that you can have. So often we can grab the SVG images with some libraries. For example, the ngx fastsvg. This one introduced many optimization into our icons. So I would like you to see the difference between these two solutions on the waterfall charts. Firstly, we have the font icons. Here, as you can see, we have to dispatch 2 requests in order to render our icons. The first one of them is the CSS request, which then triggers fetching the font file request. This process took around 14 seconds on the 3G network connection. Believe me or not, but this is really too long. Fortunately, just by implementing the SVG icons with the library that I mentioned, we can make our icons appear instantly in case you are using the SSR. Even if you are not using it, you may still consider doing that, just because this library will wait around 14.5 kilobytes and an individual icon will wait around 1 kilobyte. This is enough to optimize your initial load and make your icons appear much faster. So as we started mentioning the kilobytes in our JavaScript, let's think about how we can ship less JavaScript. This is really important just because often we ship a lot of the JavaScript. The bigger the enterprise application, the more code we ship. And what you can see here on this waterfall chart can be just a top of the iceberg in the big enterprise applications. So firstly, I would like you to understand what is the difference between the initial bundle and the lazy loaded bundle. All of the things that I included here is our initial bundle. You can see that it is the code that is required in order to render our application. You can see that on this top, where there are the frames of our application. On the other hand, we also have the lazy loaded JavaScript files, as you can see right here. This one includes the things that we don't need initially in our application. So often, optimizing our application is just as simple as moving the things that we don't need from the initial bundle into the lazy loaded bundle. We can do it by many things, but in my opinion, I would like you to see the 3 different stages. First, the optimization that you can introduce into your application is removing the CommonJS dependencies. The CommonJS module format was created with the servers in mind, and as a result, it often lacks many optimization features, especially in the modern world applications. So just by using a single import from a from a common JS library, you will end up importing the whole library to your project. This Lodash is just a tiny case. Imagine what would it be in case you imported a big charts library into your application. This would be likely a terrible mistake. Therefore, I think we should always prioritize using the AS modules libraries, which support a thing called tree shaking, which allows us to import our code granularly. You can see this on the bottom here, where we instead imported the isEmpty function from the Lodash.es module, that is the AS module-based library. Another example how you can optimize the library is that you can replace the moment.js with the date.js. It is really much more lightweight and, in my opinion, will really make a difference in how your initial bundle size will look like. So in case you're planning to bring a new library into your project, make sure to check it up on the Bundlephobia website and make sure that it supports the tree shaking. So another thing that you can utilize to decrease your initial bundle size is the dynamic import function. This one will be used in cases where you don't need the code initially or you're rarely using it. So make sure to wrap your imports around all of the things that you don't need. So for example, dialogues, side menus, some parts of the state management libraries, and of course, a classic example, roads. In cases you're using the Webpack compiler, you can take a look here. This one, property Webpack chunking command, can be really useful because it will name your output file that is lazy loaded during the build process. This can allow you to name this file, and as a result, you can understand which particular file in your bundle represents which chunk in your code. But even those two things won't matter in case you have a not properly working tree shaking in your application. This can be a nightmare. And let's think how the tree shaking should work. So here we have a simple example. We imported a code from the A file that is placed in our utils folder into our application. As you can see here, we would expect that we only imported 2 kilobytes into our application. And this is what happens with the direct imports. Unfortunately, the real cases are not that simple. Often, in our project, we use the barrel files that prettify our imports. And as you can imagine, this can make some mess. This usually happens because our imports are no longer direct, and as a result, bundlers sometimes may not be able to decide if a particular code should or should not be included in our initial bundle. So let's take a look at the example. Here in the A, B, and C file, we export a constant and log it out into the console. In the middle, we have a barrel file that re-exports all of these constants, and finally, we import our A constant in the app component file, which then gets console logged with a message that our app component has been created. As you can see here in the output, even though we have not referenced the B and C files directly, our code includes the B and C file code. In my opinion, this is often undesired, and personally, I would not expect that these things would be included in my application bundle. Therefore, it makes me think whether these barrel files are really useful. Often they are, but they have a big cons. Just because we can write some side effects in our application, for example, console log, window writes, we can make the things in our code and not reshakable. And even if you're not writing a side effects code like a good Angular developer, sometimes the bundler may not be able to decide to tree shake things in your application. Are you ready to pay this price just for using the barrel files? In my opinion, sometimes the pretty imports are not worth it. But what in case you're working in an XML repository where you are forced to use the barrel files in things like their libraries? The barrel files here are the entry points to the libraries, and we are forced to use them. So luckily, there's a solution to this problem. And believe me or not, this one is as simple as adding the side effects false property into our package.json. This tiny little setting enables the more aggressive tree shaking in our applications, which can directly lower the impact of the barrel files in our application. Note that after introducing this setting in my project, we managed to reduce our initial bundle size by up to 18%, which in my opinion is a really big number. So for the things that got tree shaken from our application is, for example, an auth module that was required in completely another application in my monorepository. Note that this auth module should never be included in my application at all, and I wonder what your application may include in case you're not using this tiny little setting. So as you know what this setting can give you, let's think about what it does. And it is as simple as our code, as our side effects code won't be run just because we referenced some files in our barrel files. So here, as you can see, the A, B, and C file code is no longer executed, and as a result, the B and C code won't be included in our application bundle. This is as simple as that, and personally, I would advise you to use the AS modules and side effects false property in every project. So now I would like to move on to the next thing that I'm pretty sure most of you know really well. But do you actually know it really well? I've got a question for you, and for the people on site, raise your hand if you think that the defer block will work in this particular scenario. For the people watching us online, type your guesses on the chat. I'm more than happy to see what you think.
What was the question?
Whether the defer block will work in this particular code scenario. That means whether the defer block will create a lazy loaded JavaScript chunk in our application build.
It won't.
It won't?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
That's my guess.
So let's see what the people online think. Okay, so I see that many people online are not sure.
They said that you already imported, so it wouldn't work.
Okay, so basically there are two scenarios. The first one of them is in case you're using the Angular version above the 18.2.8. This one was released around a week ago, and this fixed this issue where the defer block would not work. In case, if you have any other version in your project, the defer block will not work here. So as you can see here, you may consider why this actually have not worked. And this happens because in the previous versions, we referenced the chart component outside of the parent component imports array. In this particular case, we use it to type our chart component, to type our view chart query. And this messed up with our tree shaking. Fortunately, there was a fix for that. And it was as simple as importing the chart component second time, this time by using a type-only import syntax. Although it may seem weird, it actually worked. By just typing our view child query with the type-only import syntax, we allowed our defer to work. So, as you may see here, you may wonder why actually this does matter. Unless the Angular team already fixed that issue in their project, I think that we should still take a lesson from it. Believe me or not, but optimizing our code, even though we have more powerful features like the defer block, is sometimes not as easy as placing our code in the defer block. Therefore, I think that we should always verify the changes that we make to our application. Sometimes optimizing your code is not just as simple as placing it with a defer block, and I want you to see another example that can break your defer block. I'm still sure that many people here may actually use this pattern that I call the export modules. Here, in case we import the standalone components into a module and re-export them just to prettify our import, we'll also lose the functionality of the defer block. This one happens just because the defer block does not work with the ng modules. It is as simple as that. Therefore, I think we should always use the standalone modules or the standalone architecture, which, in my opinion, helps the tree shaking do its job even in the most corner cases. But what in case you hate the standalone? Still, there are many people here that think that the ng modules is thing that you should go for. In my opinion, this is not the thing that you should be having in your application. There are two reasons. First one of them is that the ng modules will be eventually deprecated, and the second one is that the standalone feature will get many other features in the future. So, for example, one feature that is coming to our standalone components is the warnings on unused imports in our components. You can see it here on the right bottom, where in case we would not use the bar directive or the full component in our application component, since the Angular 19, we would be warned that we should be removing them. So that is almost it for my presentation, but I've got just a little tiny feature for you. And in my opinion, it is something that you should be considering implementing in your application. So this is the trying to connect pop-up that, in my opinion, seriously helps the users on the free internet. In case you lost the internet connection, you will be warned that your application still is trying to connect to some server, and therefore you're able to save your changes that you make in the form. And believe me or not, this one is really simple to implement. All you have to do is to create a service with a status observable that merges two events, online and offline. Also, make sure to pass an initial value of navigator.online and subscribe to the stream. Just during the subscription, you can make whatever you want. So for example, you can display a toast or some message to the user that he's lost his internet connection. So that would be it from my side. Believe me or not, but sometimes optimizing your application may be a really hard process, and this topic is really deep. Just because it is the top of the iceberg in the world of optimizing the initial load time in your application.
Okay. Thank you, David, for your great presentation. And now let's dive into the Q&A session. So for people online, I just remind you, you can put your questions in the chat. And for those of you who are with us today offline, you can just raise your hand and we'll reach you and you can ask your question.
Thanks so much for presentation. I have a question. Do you compare last version of Angular and previous one for the size and loading time?
So I have not, but personally, after I... Oh, okay, sure. So a guy on the site asked whether I compared the last version of the Angular to the previous one and whether it affected the build size. So in my opinion, this shouldn't make a big difference. Often when I compare the two Angular versions, there is just a tiny little difference of a maximum of few kilobytes, which often does not make a really big impact on your application initial loading time. Okay.
More questions?
So, David, like you showed us a lot of like possible techniques, but my question is, if you start optimizing, what is your way of starting with? How you dig, search, and how you apply the particular techniques?
So that mostly depends at which stage your application may be. Firstly, I would use the lighthouse just to make sure that I am including a few essential techniques of optimizing my initial application. Then often I would go for more powerful tools and check if I load too much JavaScript into my application. But in my opinion, the most important thing of diagnosing why my application may be loading really slowly is to go for the waterfall charts. They basically tell us all of the things that you should know. So for example, whether a particular CSS file may be blocking your application from displaying the screen, or whether you are just loading too much JavaScript. If so, I would often research how I can fix my potential issue. So for example, how I can make the CSS file load faster, or how I can reduce my JavaScript file size even more.
Okay, we have one question from our chat from Amos. How would you optimize icons initial loading without third-party libraries?
So personally, I would use the SVG icons directly, and this is often what could work for the client-side rendered application. In my opinion, this is something that we can do, but on the long term, we should not be using. For example, in cases we have a list that the icon is a particular bullet of the list, in my opinion, in such cases, we would copy and paste the SVG icons, and as a result, we would increase our initial bundle size even more. Therefore, I think often we should take advantage of some of the libraries that are on the market, just because using the SVG icons with a tag can often harm your initial bundle. It is not the case if you're using the icons just a few times, but it will be the case in case you are using the same icon in multiple places. So for example, if you're using the same icon in 5 components that are different, in my opinion, at this point, you should consider reusing the icons. For example, you can take advantage of the library that I mentioned, but there are also 2 other libraries that can help you with that issue.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Bartosz. Will this example of loading a component for Webpack for dialog service also work for ESBuild?
So I also checked this just before this presentation. And unfortunately, this Webpack channelling comment, as of now, does not work in the ES Builder. I know that they're planning to introduce this in the future, but I would not expect this to be anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much, David. It was the last question, so thank you again for taking the time to join us today. Okay, now it's time to introduce our second speaker, Mateusz Stefańczyk, who is a developer truly involved in the Angular community. Recently, Matt has offered a series of free Angular consultations for anyone interested. Next week, Matt will be hosting a webinar on how to optimize your Angular app performance. It will be on Wednesday, October 23rd at 6 p.m. Be sure to join. And today, Matt will discuss custom store features in NGRX Signal Store. Matt, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so as Chris said already, hello guys, my name is Mateusz Stefańczyk. On daily basis, I work as an Angular team lead in House of Angular. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Okay. We have some issue with internet, so wait a second. Okay. So I need to repeat myself probably. So hello guys, my name is Mateusz Stefańczyk. On daily basis, I work as an Angular team leader in House of Angular. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. But also before I start with my presentation, I really want to congratulate to David because your presentation was really awesome and great, well structured. So congratulations, David. I will skip this part because you already know, we know that we are also having the blog, which is called Angular.love. We are supporting it. We are supporting this blog. We're supporting a lot of community effort. As a House of Angular, we are sponsors of NGRX, NGNet, NX, and a lot of meetups around Europe. We are also running our own community. And recently, Angular.love has rewrite its blog to be fully based on the Angular. This project is completely open source, so you can deep dive into the code, see how we have done it, how we... What? Okay. How we apply there in action some recent features. It also was some big effort, community effort from our team. So we are also extremely open to hear your voice if something is, in your opinion, done well, or we should correct something. Just we are extremely open for your feedback. And today we are going to talk about the custom store feature in NGRX Signal Store. How many of you is familiar or are familiar with NGRX tooling? Okay, so not that much. I see there one guy with headphones is not familiar as well, but hopefully he will learn something. Okay, so today we will take a look at the evolution of NGRX state management tooling, because this tooling is evolving alongside with Angular. So there is a lot of similarities what's going on in Angular and what's going on then with NGRX state management. Then we'll make a brief introduction to the Signal Store and the custom store features. And finally, we'll see in action how we utilize custom store features during creation of Angular.love block, and we will do some quasi-live coding of rewriting some kind of the functionality to be done in scope of the custom store features. So starting with evolution of NGRX state management, it's evolving with discussions around of the community and how Angular is approaching some kind of the features. So let's say when we had the time in the past where there was a lot of discussion how we should manage the state of our component, that it should be more local, narrow to the components, they introduced the component store because there was the need, there was the discussion in the community, and all of the people agreed that this kind of the tooling might be very helpful. Right now we have the signals in the Angular. Angular is doing a lot of things with a functional approach, and it's end up with new state management being the signal store. NGRX signal store, that's it. So it's evolving alongside with Angular. And for those who are familiar, this picture might be very familiar, but for some other people, it might be something new. So this was the very first state management library released by the NGRX. It's inspired by some pattern called Redux, and it involves a lot of effort to build something around it. Yeah, so it has its advantages, but also disadvantages. So the advantage of this solution is fact that every single action and activities across of this kind of the state management has its own dedicated file and place to take. What is the disadvantage? It's a lot of boilerplate to really implement even the simple, I don't know, requests or something like that. Yeah. So there are some disadvantages and benefits, but how it usually, and we also call it global state because it's like the single slice of the state per entire application. Yeah. So you don't have possibility to have like multiple more narrow slices with exactly same type of the data, but dedicated for particular components. It's technically possible, but it's not what this state management is for. It's more global one. And how it usually works is that we have our component which dispatch the actions. And actions being listened in scope of the reducers and effects. Reducers are for updating our store with based on the particular action and payload they are getting. And effects usually are responsible for handling some kind of the maybe logic and making the request. So as you see in the picture, they are reaching somewhere outside of our application through the service. In most cases, it's database. They are fetching the data from the database. And again, effects are dispatching them own action. And this action is, again, listened in the reducer. Reducer update our store. And whenever our store being updated, the selectors, which are some kind of the listeners for the changes of specific property in store, updating our components. And we usually work in this kind of the circle. And whenever we want to fetch the books, update the book, we need to create again a new action. But it's usually a group of the actions because we want to track a lot of information. So first we say, fetch me the books. If we saying fetch me the books, we are also saying like the books being fetched and so on. Then we are saying the books, for example, were successfully fetched or were fetched without success. Yeah, so there is an error. So usually it involves 3 actions for example, 1 request. So that's from where the boilerplate was coming from. And recently, in recent years, there was also some big effort to minimalize this kind of the boilerplate, but it's still there. We are not able to minimize everything. So the next iteration was kind of the lighter edition of the state management. It was the component store. And this component store allows us to create multiple independent states, even the same states per the various components, much smaller, but it also had its own disadvantages. So maybe it was more narrow, more dedicated for the component, but in the time of the creation, a lot of the projects already were in the NGRX store. They were based on the NGRX store. And this component store has been fulfilling the role of some kind of the facade. But also, as you can see on this picture, that's what I said, that the NGRX store had this possibility of having everything in the separate file. Here, almost everything, despite of the selects, has to be in the single file. And when the people has been utilizing this component store too much and putting too much logic there, they have been growing rapidly, extremely fast, and became hard to maintain, hard to test, because, for example, at the left side where we have NGRX store, we can test only selectors, we can test only reducers, we can test only effects. In component store, even if we are testing only select, we need to prepare the mocks for everything. So it was not easy to maintain as well. And right now we are at the third iteration of the state management, where we have the signal store. And signal store, using the signal store is very similar in the usage like building something from the Lego blocks. So they provide us with multiple blocks which we can utilize to create our state. And the custom store features are the blocks which we are able to create by our own. So from the blocks they are just providing us, we can distinguish with state, which is simply the function to define our state. So what is the structure of our state? Usually we provide the structure and the initial state value. Then with methods, which allow us to define the methods in scope of our state. With computed, which let us to define computed properties from other computed properties or from the initial state. And with hooks, which are very similar to the hooks we have in the Angular components, so ng on init and ng on destroy to do something during this time span. Also, there are some more like with entities and so on, so we can distinguish more kind of the blocks. What is very specific, all of these blocks are signal store feature. So we are able to create signal store feature, but itself, when using the NGRX signal store feature, we are signal store state, we're utilizing signal store features created by the core team. Yeah. So when we are building, we are building or exactly same things they are just delivering to us. Okay, so we'll take a look how simply it is to create the state using this store using this library. So we need to define it using the function which is called signal store, and then we can start utilizing the particular blocks. So we are saying that we build it with the state. State will contain the books library, which is type of the books. We can define that there will be the methods for adding the books. We can define the computed, which will be filter for us the books which are, I don't know, for us to rent and so on. And this kind of the simple free blocks we utilize to create the very simple bookstore. And right now we have custom store feature, which is our blank block, which we can utilize the way we really want. So right now I will go to some examples from our repository, how we have utilized this functionality. So I will change it to make it visible for you. It was probably this one. Is it fine? More or less. Okay. So first, let's take a see what kind of the signal store features we have in our block right now. So we have the signal store feature for language, and simply what's it doing? It's just mapping the currently selected language from the translocale to signal, And right now, having this kind of the feature, which is called with lang state, we are able to provide the information about the language to any kind of the signal store we have in our application. Yeah, so we encapsulate the logic of fetching the information about the language into simple signal store feature, and we can utilize it right now in multiple places. Same thing apply with CEO. So we have defined kind of the methods like setting the meta, setting the title. We wrap it around the signal store feature, and we utilize it in the place where we need to set these particular properties. And we do it once. We don't repeat this logic anymore because we have it encapsulated in scope of the signal store feature. And right now, if our application is fully based on the signal store, it's extremely easy to encapsulate some repeatable logic there and use it everywhere we want. Yeah, so by applying this kind of the feature, our store get it capabilities. Yeah, so right now by providing with CEO here, our article detail store will have access to two methods, set meta and set article. We can maybe see even how they are being used. Let's see. Okay. It's CEO service. Yeah, we can see, for example, there we simply make store.setMeta, and this store already have these methods because we set it there. Same, it's already have access to the language because we defined that using this custom store feature. And what we will do right now, we have kind of the page which user being navigate to after Manfred is here, but he's also here. So yeah, wherever we test, like search for something like that test, okay, it's suddenly not working. I broke something. Okay, let me see what's the problem then. I hope it should be fine, but it's not. Dominic just make something when I was on the coffee. Okay, it's here. It's not able to create this computed for me. It's happen when you make TS ignore too often. Okay, it's not able to create this computed. And this one will work. Oh, I see. Okay, let me just bring the whole structure back. Now should be fine. So again, we test for something, and we have the list of our articles on our blog. And as you can see, there is small query parameter at the very top, which is Q equal test. And right now, whenever we refresh, we are able to like reproduce the recent state of your search. And how it's currently work, it's done using, we have the presenter service. I don't know whether you're familiar with this kind of the services or not, but they are some kind of the services for the purpose of the specific component. And in this kind presenter service, we have some inject route search params service function, which bring to us current query and current page. And with these parameters in scope of our constructor, component constructor, we call the search method from the state with these search payload parameters. And what we will try to do, we'll try to keep this functionality working, but get rid of need for containing these parameters in scope of the presenter, and also get rid of calling it from the constructor. Yeah? So that will be the final structure of our code, and that's what we are reaching to. What we need to do, we need to create the custom feature for ourselves, which will take the parameters from the query and make them the part of our state. So instead of fetching the data based on the informations from presenter, our search list store will start fetching this information whenever it's being in it. And for this purpose, we'll need the new signal store feature, which I called with query param. And what it will be doing, it will accept as a parameter the object containing the, let's see how it will looks like. So here we will pass an object as a parameter containing the name of the query, of the parameter we are looking for. So in our case, it was Q, as I well remember, and its initial value. And there was also the page, and its initial value was 1. So this way, we will say to our feature that initialize my state with this kind of the query parameters as a part of the store. And what we will do there, I already have this code because Natalia said that I will fail in the live coding for sure, so don't do it. Okay, I said, okay, I will not do it for you. So what we need to do, so first, I will create my initial state, and I simply doing it by iterating over the keys of my config, which is this object, and setting the key value as an initial state. Yeah, so it will end up with mostly same object we are passing. Yeah, so it will end up with Q being the string and page being the one. So by having this initial state, we can start returning our signal store feature. So we start with saying with state, which accept the initial state, which I said being exactly this what we passed there. And then we define the hook. And we say that whenever it's being init, lets it map our queries to contain the values from the snapshot, because that's what we already have in our presenter. So if we look at our presenter, we have been saying that the page being the query param get page 1, and the query has been snapshot query param get Q. So right now, I move this entire logic to be triggered in scope of the onInit of the store, which will inject this feature. And again, here I iterate over the config and patching the state. So right now, I simply updating the properties of the state to contain the values from query param. If not, let's take the default value again. I simply, with that code, I am able right now to say to my signal store, that which is aware right now that it contains the Q and page, that he should call onInit search method with these parameters. So we can simply do there with hooks, say onInit store, and we have the search method, which is based on the Rx method. It's some kind of the utility to make some RxJS-based code in scope of the signal store. And it accepts the object containing the query and page. So right now we don't have this object, but we are able to create it from our query params. So I will create new computed property. Let's name it search params. We can right now say it contains Q and page because we define it there. So here we have access to the entire store. And we can say that the query being Q and page being page, but also they are signals. So I need to make sure to read it properly. Expected. Okay. I see. It's like that. Okay. And right now, what I can do, I can also don't take entire store. I can take search params, search as well. It's fine. And search and say that I'm calling the search with search params. It starts complaining, but we'll ignore it for the while. Let's see whether it's working right now. So we don't have call to presenter in our constructor. We have everything hidden in scope of the search list store. So it should work. So let's refresh. Yeah, and as you can see, it's working exactly the same, but right now all kind of the informations I need are encapsulated in my search store. They simply synchronize with our router query params, and we have everything in single place. And what's more, we have extremely reusable signal store feature, because utilizing the query params, you will be utilizing them in multiple places across of an application you are creating. So it's extremely reusable feature. You can even extend it further, like it can contain the methods to set the query params. It can contain the methods to read some query params with custom converter, because that's what we are doing in our projects in real life. Yeah, so this config is slightly extended, so it's accept the default value like that, let's say this way, but it's also accept the converter, because it's simply like the string right now. Yeah, but it might be that it will be the filters, and the filters are the objects. So what we are doing, you will say, okay, I need the converter which say like read, and the way I read my parameters, and also like to set them, yeah, because we need to convert them to some string, for example. Yeah, so these values might map differently set. It's kind of the example. I don't say it might be like one-to-one this way, but that's probably what more kind of the advanced cases will need to. But as you can see, simply on this example, signal store feature is extremely powerful tool which let us to build custom blocks which we can utilize across of the various states in our application. Okay, and that was it. So if you have some questions.
Have you already written this?
Just a sec.
Sorry.
Okay. Can you? Just a sec. Okay. Oh, no. I bet you can hear me now. So let's jump into our Q&A session, and we already have our first question.
Okay, thanks. So you said that your blog is open source. Does it contain some examples of this feature?
Signal store features?
Yes.
Yeah, so that...
So we can just check it out and see how it works in real life, yeah?
Yeah. So you can give me the mic because I need to... Okay, I can say like that. Yeah, okay, so the question was whether the blog is open source and you can really see in action this kind of the signal store features. Yeah, so it's being open source. This specific is not there yet, but we can add it. Maybe we'll do, but there are some other extremely useful signal store features. So definitely you can take a look, and despite of like the CEO and so on, there is some other very common. It was first introduced by Alex Okrushko in some other cases in the previous iterations of the state management, which is called call state, where we also have it's wrapped as kind of the feature. And what call state is doing, it's letting you to set in what kind of the state is your, maybe not the state, because we are doing it mostly entities. So let's say, maybe not the entities as well, because you can apply it to the entities, but you can also apply it to entire state. But it's about managing the current state of your state management, let's say. So we can say it's loading, it's in progress, it's loaded, and so on. So it's about that, managing this kind of the states. Yeah, so we utilize it in a lot of cases. As you can see, it's mostly for utilizing the informations where the article details has been fetched and so on, and it's automatically create for us the properties dedicated for providing these informations. Yeah, so you can simply by adding with call state fetch article details, it creates for us property able to contain this information. Yeah, so we can say fetch article details call state loading, and based on that you might, I don't know, display the spinner. Yeah, and then when we fetch this, it says there is an error or it's already loaded. Yeah, so this is kind of the feature we utilize, and probably all kind of the business stores in our application are utilizing it for fetching the informations, for applying the informations about the fetching state. Yeah, but it's not only for fetching. That's the most common use case, but you can utilize it in the various other cases.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have this one question. Imagine situation. Tomorrow you have your client and they want you to create application from the scratch. Of course, you decide to use Angular for front-end.
Yes.
And now you need to decide what state management library to use. So do you have algorithm how to decide which store you would use, or you just go with something specific?
No, I have no doubts that I will use NGRX, yeah? And which one of them I will use for a particular use case, it's per use case, yeah? Because maybe for some of them I will say like the Redux base is the best one, but I'm not saying it. But for sure I will go with NGRX, yeah. I used to work with NGXS and also love this state management, really, it's great. And if I will have to work with it tomorrow, I will not like join the project and say, no, we guys need to rewrite it to be NGRX or something, you know. But when I start from scratch, I really like what the Signal Store right now provides. It's extremely flexible and powerful for me. Some other questions?
Yep.
Okay, there is.
Okay.
Thanks so much. So I have a question about which store is better, because now I'm advocating about Signal Store project, and my teammate asked question about how to say supporting, and which maybe have some insights about future features and so on, and how it.
Yeah. So your friend has doubts whether it will be supported. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for sure it will be supported, like all of them are supported, you know. That's probably the safest one in terms of the support, I would say, from the state management perspective, yeah. Because during this entire time we had a bunch of the state management libraries, and NGXS is, for example, great library, but has pretty slow support, I would say. Also, there was state management Akita, which a lot of people really likes in the past. I don't know what's going on with this library. I don't hear about it anymore, yeah? Is it still being supported or no? I'm not sure, but there is not a lot of news from this platform. So NGRX was all this time supported, and what's more, it's just still delivering some new features and new state management libraries. So for sure it will be supported.
Okay, because we have questions about component store, because it's not supported so good as in and so
yeah,
that's why I asked about.
Yeah. So I think like with component store, you have to look at the Signal Store as a replacement for component store. That's why it might looks like it not being. I think it's supported, but it's not being. How to say? There is no new upcoming features. Yeah. So it's stable. If there will be bug, they will fix this bug, but they are not putting new stuff there. That's how I see it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have more questions in the chat. So first will be from Satsuya21. How do unit test those stores with Karma and Jasmine?
Yeah, so it's a tough question, to be honest. And there was no clear pattern how to test it yet, and this discussion being still open, probably on the GitHub. I was even involved in that one. So there is no strict guidelines yet, but they should be soon, and we'll have the best practices and way to test this.
Okay, thank you. And one last question from Alexei. Do you know if NGRX team works or have plans on improving language services for Signal Store? Now go to implementation on Signal Store computed or method goes to the Signal Store type?
Yes, and I think it was fixed in the recent versions. So let me see. I'm not sure whether.
Wyszedłeś ze StreamYarda.
Nie wyszedłem, no jestem cały czas. Okay, okay, so I need to share the screen again.
Yep, we need to get to the code. Yeah, it's there.
So let's see. Yes, so this one is again like moving us to, oh my goodness, Natalia. Okay, but yeah, so this is then this advantage, but I believe it was somehow fixed in the recent version. So the answer simply is yes, they are working on this one, they are still improving. And for example, there in the past was situation where you could create, because you might like repeat these blocks again. So there was possibility to create like with computed, and let's quickly do it. I could name it return test. Let's say it was some kind of the computed, and you could let it be like that, and you could repeat this computed then, because there are cases where you will be repeating these blocks, or as for example you might utilize some signal store feature, and then in the store which is using it, by mistake you might override the property. And there was possibility, because this is older version of the NGRX in our block right now, that this test is overriding this test, and it's not arising you any kind of the issue. So for example, in the recent version, it's already fixed. So you will get an error in this kind of the scenarios, yeah? Sorry, so even if there I will have the test property, it will already throw an error here for me. Because with this encapsulating a lot of logic, there is high probability that by mistake you will override some kind of the properties. So yes, they are working on this, and it's still improving from version to version.
Okay,
There's
great.
a question.
Oh, okay. One more.
Yeah. I forgot to ask about the debugging tool, because in NGRX we get cool stuff for it. And what about the signal store?
So Manfred probably can answer this question as well, since Rainer is working on some debugging tool, yeah? So maybe you can provide us with some insights.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. The thing is, the Angular team will officially add some features to the Angular debug console for visualizing signals. And what we did, we have this NGRX toolkit, and it has several such custom features like we have seen here, like with call state and so on. And there is with NGRX debug tools, or perhaps just with debug tools. And if you call this method, then you can use the NGRX debugger to just look into your different stores. And so you can find out at runtime what's going on there, which state you have there, and so on. Yeah. And besides this, the Angular team, as mentioned, will also allow to visualize signals eventually.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so there is tooling for that one.
Yep. Okay, so we've reached the end of our Q&A session. Thank you, Matt, once again.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time for a short 10-minute break. For our online participants, I remind you about the online networking possibility via Google Meet. The link will be on the chat, and we'll see each other in 10 minutes and continue with Manfred's talk. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Our little break is over. So it's time to introduce our last speaker, Manfred Steyer. I bet you all already know Manfred, but in case you don't, he's a trainer and consultant and Angular architect, but he's also very active blogger and speaker, sharing his extensive knowledge and experience with community pretty much all around the world. Manfred was also present on our Spring Camp with an online talk about ways of using Angular signals. And today he will share some knowledge in the topic of vertical architectures for scalable Angular applications. Please welcome Manfred with a round of applause.
It's really nice to be back here in Poland, in Warsaw again. And yeah, this talk will be about vertical architectures. Does everything work here with the mic? No. Okay, so I have to talk into here, or is this good?
This one is
both. Okay, cool. Great, yeah. So this will be about vertical architectures for scaling your large-scale enterprise applications. And I want to get started not with this grumpy gardener here, but with this picture. It's a similar picture, but it's a bit different. What do you see here?
No tooling.
There's no tooling, yeah, no tooling. There are neighbors, and they have a conversation, a good conversation, I guess. So this guy here is smiling, and everything seems to be nice. And one reason why they are good neighbors might be, and this is not that obvious, those fences here. Perhaps you know the saying, good fences make good neighbors. And this is also true for software development. If you have a huge application that needs to grow over time, that is implemented by several people or even several teams, then you also need good fences. You need so-called verticals. The verticals are the grounds, and the spaces between those verticals are the fences. And usually each vertical has several features that are correlating with each other. Those features are quite clear to each other. Often they know about each other. However, between those verticals, we try to have minimal dependencies. A vertical should know as little as possible about other verticals because we want to evolve the application here without breaking something there. Another important aspect here is that usually you try to align your team structure with your verticals. There is this so-called Conway's law. It's meanwhile several decades old. Back then, at the end of the 60s, Conway, an US-American computer scientist, made this observation. They called it law, but it's more of an observation. And the observation is that your team structure always mirrors your architecture. Or to be more precise, the other way around, the architecture mirrors your team size. So by looking at your architecture, you can tell something about your team structure. And I know this sounds quite theoretical, but a very practical way to explain it is if you tell 3 teams to implement one compiler, you get a compiler that is using 3 phases to compile your source code. Because obviously somehow those teams need to share tasks. They need to split the tasks. And usually a team member is talking more often to the members of their own team compared to members of other teams. And this also means we can influence our architecture by structuring the teams accordingly. This is more or less what Conway's law is telling us, or at least what the consequences and the learnings of Conway's law are. So at the end of the day, we want to have verticals, we want to have features within verticals that correlate with each other, and we want to have loosely coupling, or at least low coupling, between those verticals. And we want to align with our team structure. At the end of the day, this also helps us to stop this cascade here, where you break something here and also break something over there. We really want to avoid this. Most of the times, your changes should be local. This sounds quite nice and it sounds somehow logical. However, it comes with a lot of further questions. One question here is, how large should a vertical be? When is it too tiny? When is it too large? How to find good verticals? How to implement them? How to enforce rules? How to make sure that not each and every vertical is directly talking with each and every other vertical? And how to analyze your implementation? And those are the questions I want to answer today. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I'm Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular, and I'm focusing on Angular in the enterprise. In this role, I'm visiting a lot of companies. I'm helping them with consulting, with workshops, also with reviews. And besides this, I'm also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy to work together with people around the globe. Meanwhile, we are quite present in whole Europe. We have several customers here in Poland, but also in the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, and so on. Okay, so let's get started with the first question. How large should a vertical be? And there is no definitive answer to this question. However, there are two forces. One force is defining the minimum size, and another size is defining the maximum size of a vertical. And ideally, you are somewhere between those two forces. So if we look to the one side, the minimum size, then I would say a vertical should be huge enough to fit correlating features, because we want to have all the changes locally to one vertical. We don't want to have a situation where we need to change 5 verticals just to update one feature. This would be not the idea of all of this, because the idea is to have local changes, to concentrate on one thing, and to make a good job in this very tiny aspect. So correlating features should fit one vertical. And the force for the maximum size is the team size. A vertical should not be larger than what a team can achieve. Ideally, we have just one team and not several teams working on a vertical, because we don't want to have that much interaction. It is somehow counterproductive if we have to talk to 3 other teams before implementing a new feature. This was the first question about the size. The second question is not that easy to answer. It's about how to identify good verticals. There are several answers to this. But one answer I really love is this here. It's about domain-driven design. Domain-driven design, which is quite an old thing, it has been around for 20 years now, tells us to align our software with business domains, with areas from the real world out there. You know, the real world is where the pizza boy comes from. That means we look out into the real world and we try to mirror the areas of this real world in our software. This idea is also nothing but new. I think the whole object orientation is about this basic idea, but domain-driven design goes far beyond that. I've told you before, it has been around for more than 20 years. However, it's still a thing. Perhaps it's even more a thing nowadays than back then. This book here, that was the starting point of all of this, is still a bestseller on Amazon. And I think this is nothing a lot of people achieve. To write a book now about software development, that is still a bestseller in 20 years. So normally this is not the case. When I think about my Angular book, then I exactly know every 3 years I can take the book and throw it away and rewrite it, because everything is changing. By the way, there is also a vivid community, and there are also new things introduced into domain-driven design from time to time. There are conferences and so on. So if we look at domain-driven design, then we see at least 2 traditional disciplines. The one discipline is strategic design, and the other one is tactical design. When we talk about architecture, we talk mainly about strategic design, because strategic design gives you several patterns for decomposing a huge team into several parts. And you could tell or call those parts verticals, verticals that don't know much about each other, which is our goal, isn't it? Tactical design is more a bit about design patterns and practices. It's about stuff like going with entity classes, going with aggregates, going with factories, going with repositories. This is somehow common knowledge, meanwhile, and this does not really affect our architecture. That's why most of the times when I'm talking about architecture, I'm referring to the strategic design part of domain-driven design. So the big question is now, what is strategic design telling us? How can we apply strategic design to decompose a system into tinier parts, into verticals? Well, one basic answer is not to write a huge system that is capable of everything. For instance, if you have a system that is controlling your flight tickets, the temperature of your coffee, and the nuclear power plant in the neighborhood, perhaps it does a bit too much. You really try to have tinier parts that are specialized into one aspect. So instead of writing a flight system, in my example, you would go with a booking part, a check-in part, and so on. And you call those parts subdomains. They mirror, as mentioned before, areas from the real world. And then you implement them somehow into your application. How you implement them is up to you. There are several strategies. You could go with folders per subdomain. You could go with several NPM packages per subdomain or libraries in your NX monorepo. You could even go with applications of their own. And this is fun now, because if each subdomain becomes an application of its own, we speak about micro frontends. This really shows how all of this is nicely fitting together. A micro frontend is nothing else than a subdomain who was put into an own application. So identifying areas in the real world is one part of finding good verticals. Another part of finding good verticals is looking at business processes. And here I'm really sorry, because we all thought we are technicians and we don't need to deal with business processes. But truth is, if you really want to identify good verticals, you have to. You have to look at the business processes. You have to know what's going on there in the domains you want to support with software. And when it comes to those processes, you can watch out for 3 different things. One thing is the vocabulary. If you are using the same vocabulary in different process steps, then this might be an indicator that those process steps belong to one subdomain and hence to one vertical. So in this case, we have, for instance, luggage. We have luggage here, and we are using it in check-in luggage and pick-up luggage. And what's more important, we are using it in the same sense. We are referring to exactly the same if we use the word luggage here and there. This is important, because I'm quite sure you're also using the term luggage here when booking a flight. But here you mean something different with luggage. Here the luggage is just an option you have to pay for, the option to bring 1 or 2 suitcases. Here we are talking about the real physical luggage that is checked in and hopefully picked up afterwards. So this is one indicator, same vocabulary and the same meaning. Another indicator, and this is a bit more abstract, but also a bit more helpful, is the so-called pivotal event. A pivotal event happens every time you are relieved. So think about what you are doing when booking a flight. You are really stressed out because no one understands airlines. We all know prices are going up on a regular basis. So we are really stressed out. We need to book this flight. We need to finally find time to book this flight to get a good price. But if we have booked a flight, we are relieved. because we know, okay, nothing can happen, we have our ticket, it's fine. And then we have this so-called pivotal event. And after this event, it goes on a perhaps different place, perhaps at a different time, perhaps even with different people if you book for someone else. It goes on when you arrive at the airport. And one more time, you are stressed out. You need to be in time, you need to check in, you need to go through the metal detector frame and so on. But when you have done all of this, then you are relieved once again. You know, nothing much can happen anymore. I'm at the right gate. I just need to enter the plane at the right moment. So I think this really shows that such a pivotal event is some point in time where you do a check on your task list. Or to put it in another way, if your life was an action movie, then the pivotal event would be a scene cut. Something happened, a lot of bombs and shootings, and we are done, scene cut. We are going on with the next scene when we arrive at the airport. Well, in my case, my life is not that much of an action movie. It's more of one of those French movies, you know them, with a lot of dialogues. But anyway, also they have a lot of scene cuts. So that means if we look to the pivotal events, this here would very likely be a domain. And this is overlapping. That's why I told you before, those heuristics just give you indicators for what could be a good subdomain and for what could be a good vertical. And here I'm really doing this with purpose. I want to show you that not every time those different indicators need to point into the same direction. There is another heuristic, namely roles. If you look to the roles involved there, perhaps even to divisions those roles are part of, then you see that the check-in agent and the boarding agent is the same person. That's why you should be nice to them when checking in, you see them again. And when we go with this aspect, grouping everything according to roles, then this is another candidate for a domain slice. And one more time, I really made this up. We don't have those overlapping situations all the times, but I really made this up to show you those indicators are helpful, but they are just indicators, and perhaps they are pointing into different directions. Nevertheless, they can be helpful. And perhaps you are saying now, boy, this looks complicated. And yes, it's not a strict science. However, there is a good message. To cite the philosopher Michael Jackson, you are not alone. You have Alberto Brandolini, who invented something that's called event storming. Who has done event storming so far? Let me know. Oh, some of you, that's really nice. So the basic idea of event storming is to bring people together. People from the business side, people from the technical side, architects, developers. You bring them together, you lock them up in a room like this one here, and you need to have a lot of white walls, or at least walls. And then you begin modeling your business process with post-its. And the most important post-it here is the orange one, because the orange post-it shows you events that happens during the, let's call it, user journey, during the business process. And then there are other post-its with other colors, like tasks or like entities, aggregates, or roles involved here or there. But the main aspect here is the event, and that's why it's called event storming. So you try to model everything, your process on a wall with post-its. And if you think, well, someone stick this post-it on the wrong location, you start a discussion. And this allows you to bring all the knowledge together from the business side and from the technical side. That's the first aspect. When you have your business processes, then you draw the lines. You can do it with a board marker, or sometimes you just need a stripe to just define borders between the process steps. And one more time, if you think the border is on the wrong location, you start a discussion. And so one more time, you bring together the knowledge of different people. And at the end of this, you have a good first domain slicing. You have good first domain boundaries. You know where it makes sense to slice your whole system into parts. By the way, 2 additional fancy terms from domain-driven design before we look into another discipline. One fancy term here is the so-called bounded context, and another fancy term is the so-called ubiquitous language. Let me explain. The thing when going with domain-driven design is that you don't try to model the whole world. Usually you only model one domain at once, here booking or boarding. And that's why we have flights 2 times. You might say now, well, this is not try. This violates the try principle. Don't repeat yourself. This is code duplication. But hopefully it's not. Very often it's not code duplication because we have a different perspective to our entities, to our terms from within different domains. A flight from the booking perspective is something completely different than a flight from the boarding perspective. When it comes to booking, you need a lot of data because you want to sell a ticket. You need to have a lot of data and upgrade options and price options. And if you give me 100 more bucks, you can fly first class and so on. You don't need all this stuff here in boarding. When it comes to boarding, it's just about knowing who is allowed to enter which plane. So perhaps it's just an ID and a tiny amount of properties. And this is why we really try to model each and every domain separately. From the domain-driven design perspective, this gives you code that perfectly mirrors the respective area of the real world. We don't want to have generic code that covers all the possible cases. No, we want to have code that is really a mirror of this or that area of the real world, that really fits best so that people can concentrate on this area. And as a byproduct, this is really funny, as a byproduct for the software architecture, this leads to decoupled domains and hence to decoupled verticals, because not everything is cross-connected here. Let me give you a nice metaphor. Think about a map. Usually you have a map for car roads, roads for cars, or a map showing you train connections, or underground connections, or perhaps a map showing you the sewers if you work for your community, or it shows you the water pipes in the ground or the electricity pipes. But usually you don't have a map showing all of this stuff together. This would be quite confusing. This would cause cognitive overload, and it would not be helpful. It would just be too much information at once. This is the goal of domain-driven design here. So usually you model your verticals, your subdomains separately. It's not code duplication in most cases. And you have this thought border around your subdomains. And you call this thought border the so-called bounded context. This bounded context is where within the model makes sense. Outside of this bounded context, the model does not make any sense because we have different perspective to the same aspects. And inside there, we are using the so-called ubiquitous language, which is the language of your users, of the domain experts. So we don't invent terms when it's not necessary. Sometimes it's necessary because sometimes there is no good term for an aspect. But even when we do this together with domain experts. So if the domain experts call this a flight, you also call it a flight and not an air-driven transport opportunity, which would be quite generic perhaps, but it's not in the sense of DDD. So this is one aspect of identifying good verticals. It's not easy because it's not a strict science. We just have indicators and we can talk to other people, which is never a bad thing. Funnily, there is a completely different perspective to the same topic. And at first glance, it has nothing to do with verticals. But if we dig into it, we find out it is really just the second side of the same coin. It's team topologies. It's a relatively young development. I think it became popular shortly before the pandemic in 2019. And it shows you 4 fundamental team topologies, which is just a structure of a team, how to define a team and what is the responsibility of this team. And also it shows how to interact between those teams. So this here sums everything up quite nicely. Here you see those 4 different team topologies. And you also see here, I've added it, the flow. Usually you want to enable flow. You want to enable your people to produce business value as easily as possible. It should not be a burden for them to produce something that is of value for your customers. So we want to have some flow there, no showstoppers, no impediments, no situations where we have to wait for 3 weeks for other teams before we can go on. And the most important team topology for this flow is the so-called stream-aligned team. It's a team having everything they need to implement business value in a given area. Those stream-aligned teams are supported by enabling teams. They teach them with regards to some special areas like, let's say, CI/CD, if this is a topic in your company, or perhaps stuff like database optimization, UX, or accessibility performance. But the goal is that eventually the stream-aligned team has all this knowledge, and that's why the enabling team is not taking on those tasks. They are helping them to learn how to deal with such complicated special tasks. Sometimes we have an own team for a complicated subsystem. For instance, if you have something that is very complex, a compiler. I have some customers that have their own compilers for writing code for adopting and standard software to different needs. Or perhaps you have to do some calculations in there, financial mathematics calculations. This could be put in a complicated subsystem. They are not producing value by themselves. However, they're producing something that is that complex that a stream-aligned team cannot take care of it. Another example here is a team doing all those calculations for payroll accountancy. You know, payroll accountancy is really a science. There are a lot of changing laws and you have to align with them. Otherwise, you end up with 1 feet in prison. This could also be such a specialist team. And then we have the platform teams implementing technical stuff that is picked up by the stream-aligned teams. Technical stuff like your own authentication library. A lot of big companies have this, or your own design system. This is nothing the stream-aligned team should concentrate on. The shell just use it. So this is the idea of team topologies. And one big thing in there, and if you read the book, you read this term on a regular basis, is cognitive load. It's all about reducing the cognitive load of the different teams so that they can really concentrate on one aspect to provide business value for this or that area. And why this looks really different to domain-driven design, it's really somehow the same. Because also in domain-driven design, when defining subdomains, we are reducing cognitive load so that we can concentrate on one aspect. But even more, we need to slice the system into parts those teams are responsible for. And those parts are our verticals. They can be subdomains. And funnily, even though they call those things fracture lines, parts where you slice your system into tinier parts for stream-aligned teams, they also say the most common fracture line is the business domain. This is where they are referencing to domain-driven design, something that has been around for several years. This is the most common one to say. So when possible, look out for business domains. However, they also say sometimes it's not possible to fully align with business domains because there are so many forces. And so they are pointing out further fracture planes like regulatory compliances. Think about this payroll example. You have some experts that really know how to calculate all the taxes you need to pay for your employees to not end up in prison. Or change cadence. If you have one area that is not changing a lot and another area that is changing on a regular basis because you have to align with laws and otherwise you have an issue, then also this could be an indicator that you have a team for those rapidly changing stuff. And there are other things like team location, risk, performance isolation, technology, or even user personas. Perhaps a last example here, if you write an e-procurement system, then you have several business domains, but beyond that, you have 2 or 3 groups of people interacting with each other. You have the employee, you need to get a new pencil, and you need the manager that says, no, you don't get a new pencil because you already got one last week, that's too expensive. And then you have the purchase department that is putting all the metadata in there from their vendors so that the manager knows, oh, we have this pencil and we have this more affordable pencil. So perhaps this is also good enough for you. And yeah, in this case, perhaps this is a good fracture plane to slice everything according to those main roles. Okay, this was a lot of theory, but now let's come to practice. Now let's talk about how to put all of this into our source code. And for this, we have several options. When you have identified your verticals, you could implement them as folders, as libraries, NPM packages, or applications, which is where micro frontends come in. In general, what we do a lot, and here I'm referencing to the smart people from the Annex team, we are subdividing our system not only into business domains, but also into layers. For instance, we have a feature layer with smart components. We have a UI layer with dump components. The big difference here is you need smart components to drive your use cases, but smart components are not reusable. They are tinkered for one use case, buying a pencil or doing the taxes. And that's why they are not reusable. However, to get in some reusability, you have to go with dump components. You have a data layer communicating with the backend and providing your data model. And you have an utility layer for general purpose utility stuff like, authentication or internationalization, calculating dates and so on. Stuff you wished you would get for free from a library, but sometimes you don't get exactly what you need from a library. And this here brings a lot of order into your system. Everyone exactly knows where to put something and where to find something. And it allows us to define access restrictions, like we are only allowed to navigate top-down or from the left to the right. I think the later one is more important because it's more in the sense of verticals and domain-driven design, where we only navigate from left to right, which means booking can only talk to booking stuff and to shared stuff. And boarding can only talk to boarding stuff and to shared stuff. Booking and boarding are not allowed to interact with each other. We want to have low coupling between them. Also, layering is nice because it prevents for cycles. It prevents that everything is intermingled with each other. Here, a feature can only talk to UI, data, utility. Data can only talk to utility. So this decouples everything nicely. How to implement this? Well, we use NX a lot. Who is using NX? Okay, some of you. Cool. And an X gives us those module boundaries. We can define that this aspect is not allowed to communicate with that aspect of the application. And it gives us incremental CI/CD. That means we don't need to build everything every time. And we don't need to retest everything every time and relint it. And X knows what has been changed. And then only the changed stuff will be used, will be rebuilt, relinted, retested. And to speed it further up, we have the so-called build cache, but also we can do everything in parallel in the NX cloud. So this is quite nice. However, and I always have a however, if you go with traditional NX, all those cells here become libraries of their own. And for some people, this is completely okay. Some people told us, well, this is quite a lot of libraries. However, this is how NX is working, because NX mainly operates on a per library basis. And so you end up with, I have not counted, with a huge amount of libraries where you can define access restrictions where incremental CI/CD happens. To compensate for this a bit, usually we try to switch out this aspect of NX by a community library. It's the Sheriff. The DS Sheriff, it's an open source project, and it does the same on a per folder basis. Also, it works with and without NX. So if you say NX is too much for us, then perhaps Sheriff is of use anyway. So if we look at our stack here, we still use NX, but the modularization is done on a per folder level with Sheriff. It tells us, well, code in this folder is not allowed to access code in that folder. And to analyze everything afterwards, we will look into this in a minute. We have another tool, it's called the detective. You know, the Sheriff and the detective work together. In Germany, there was this Friday night soap, or it was a crime soap with a detective, and I think the other one was a lawyer. So I always have those two people in mind. They work together. The one guy had the brains and the other guy had the fists, and together they achieved a lot. Well, perhaps it's the same here with detective and sheriff. I will look into it in some minutes. And now it's demo time. And then I have an announcement for you, so stay tuned. We have something we are showcasing for the very, very first time today. And funnily, it nicely connects to the first talk about performance and barrels. So this was really a good pointer into the right direction. Thanks for this. But before I announce a brand new thing, let's have a look to our example here. In this example, we have an X workspace. It has a flights application. Besides this, it also has a miles application and a library shared between flights and miles. However, and this is the point for now, if we look into the flights application, we see several domains. Seems like the flights application is pretty huge. We subdivided it into several domains. We have a check-in domain and a luggage domain and ticketing and shared. And if we look in there, we see within, let's say, luggage, we have a data layer, we have a feature layer, we have a UI layer. Also in ticketing, we have data and also two features here. So what you see here is nothing else than a translation of the matrix we have discussed before into a folder structure. So we have slices, verticals, domains, and we have layers. Let's look here. Slices, verticals, domains, and layers, feature UI data. Feature UI data. Okay, cool. So let's look in there. For instance, let's look into ticketing. There we have a booking feature. And in there, of course, we can access stuff from other modules. from other, in our case, those are modules, but technically they are just folders protected by the sheriff. However, if we try to grab over to a part of the application we are not allowed to use, we are getting those squiggles. We are getting a hit on our fingers. It tells us, hey, Manfred, what do you think? What are you doing? You are in the domain ticketing, in the feature layer. You are not allowed to grab over to the domain luggage. Don't grab into other domains. It's like going into different buildings and taking something out of the fridge. It's not considered polite in most countries, I know. So don't do this here. You don't have clearance. Or to emphasize it, it's really forbidden. And to further emphasize it, it's verboten. You know, I've learned this from my English friends. They are really using the German term verboten to say strictly forbidden. So it seems like, German language has some qualities when it comes to strictness. Okay, cool. So we don't have any broken windows anymore. Even more, if we go to the console and run the linter, we get the same error message. And that means you can automatically check for your architecture during the commit with Husky of your source code or during your CI/CD process. And this really prevents you from getting broken windows. That's really cool. It forces people into the right direction. To get all of this, you just need sheriff. It's basically a linting rule. And then, as you can assume, you are defining tags for different folders, like a tag ticketing or feature or luggage. And then you define restrictions for those tags. So now let's go one step further. Let's analyze our architecture. Because perhaps even though we have sheriff, there are some glitches in there. And if you use NX, you know the NX graph, which is quite nice. And I really love it. The thing is, NX works as NX all the times on the level of libraries. And here we just have one library and two applications. We cannot drill into flights with NX. And to make this possible, we have another project, which is called the Detective. And this is kind of nice. At first glance, the detective gives us the same information. It says, hey, you have ticketing, you have luggage, you have check-in, and all of them are using the shared area. And here perhaps we get suspicious because we see, hey, why is ticketing directly accessing luggage? This is not allowed. Well, this is because we broke the rules before in my live demonstration. We are not allowed to grab over to our other domain. That's why we got those squiggles. So let's get rid of this. Let's save it. And now let's restart the detective. Yeah, it looks a bit better. This now looks what we have seen in our NX dependency graph. However, we can now drill down. We can say, let's go down for check-in, let's go down for luggage, let's go down for ticketing. Let's group everything by folders. And then we see, well, it seems like we have several domains. And each domain is more or less isolated. They don't talk to each other anymore. However, obviously, the modules within the domains talk to each other. This makes sense because that's why they are part of the same module. Here we also see that feature booking is using a lot of stuff from the shared area. You can tell this by looking at the thickness of this line. And when we click here, we see, here we have 7 connections. And here where the line is a bit thinner, we just have 1 connection. So this is what the structure of our application tells us, which is quite nice. I don't assume that you display everything at once. I assume that you play around a bit with it and activate and deactivate certain parts to get several impressions about the healthiness of your architecture. However, we can go deeper here. We can talk about change coupling. It looks like the same. It really looks like the same as before. However, it's a completely different kind of coupling, because change coupling tells us that perhaps this guy and that guy was changed together with one commit. That means here we are looking into your Git history. And if we find out that quite often this guy and that guy have been changed together, this is an indicator for a hidden coupling. That means even though there is no real coupling in terms of dependencies, there might be logical coupling we were not even aware of. And this gives you some further ideas of how to refine your modules. Sometimes it might be okay, but here you see quite a thick line. You see that shared seems to be custom tailored for ticketing. We have here 5 connections. That means 5 times they have been changed together. Might be okay-ish if you have 50 times in the last 1,000 commits or in the last 12 months, you can filter this here, then perhaps you should think about it. And one more time, it's just an indicator which points you to some things you should discuss, you should think about. What do we have else? Well, you remember we talked about Conway's law in the beginning, where we talked about that ideally your team structure should align with your architecture, or vice versa. Your architecture should align with your team structure, which is the case here. Everything has been done by team B. Who is team B? Yeah, you know, someone needs to do the job. But this is not a good example. It's just an example repository I wrote. So let's restart this in demo mode. When doing this in demo mode, I get some additional people randomly squeezed in here to my statistics. And now we see where there is a team A, the purple one, there is a team B, the green one. And it looks like team A is doing most of the work here. So this is not an ideal alignment between your architecture and your teams. And one more time, this just points into one direction. This is not saying you are a bad person. It is just pointing into one direction. It tells you, let's discuss about it. Perhaps we can improve something here because Conway's law is a thing. By the way, as a side product of this, you also see your drag factor if you drill down from the team level to the user level. Here, the red one is John Doe. And it looks like John Doe has implemented a lot of stuff here. So if John Doe leaves the company, you really have an issue. You have a drag factor of almost 1 here and there and over there. Here it's a bit better in ticketing. Here Jane Doe took over. Okay, so team alignment, Conway's law. Change coupling, hidden coupling, you might not be aware of. And there is a last thing, which is called hotspots. A hotspot is an area of your source code that was changed often in a short time. Here in the last 1,000 commits, or perhaps in the last 6 months, it depends on you. It was changed quite often, and it is complex. So the more often it was changed, and the more complex it is, the more it is a hotspot. And I really like this because this is not just a gut feeling. There is scientific evidence that if the same file is changing quite a lot, they call it code churn, is changing quite a lot in a short time period, then there are more issues in there. The probability of finding issues there is higher. There are several studies, and this can really be nicely automated, that point into this direction. And yeah, that's why we have this analysis here. This slider here tells you about how sensitive you should be. If we go to the left, we have more warnings and critical areas. If we go more to the right, we have less warnings and critical areas. A good starting point is 33%. That means the first third is green, the second third is yellow, the third third is red. And if we look in there, we find some files we should question. So why is this important for our architecture? Well, it's important for our architecture because if you have some files that change quite often, this might really tell you that you have an issue in this file with regards to your architecture. Perhaps you don't have a good modularization, and that's why every time you change one of those files, this file also needs to be updated. Perhaps you have duplications. In this case, you also have to change this together with that. Or perhaps you have what they call a God class, a huge file that is doing too much, including taking care of the nuclear power plant in the neighborhood. And then you also should think about splitting it up. So one more time, you get some indicators out of here. Okay, so I promised you an announcement. And I asked my colleague before, because funnily, we plan to announce it next week. But as I saw this awesome presentation about barrels, I really texted him on Slack and he gave me permission to announce it today. The thing is, Detective is currently, no, not the detective, Sheriff is currently also using barrel files, because somehow we need to define our public and private API. Sheriff needs to know what others are allowed to access and what not. However, we were never happy with it, because writing a barrel file, it's not complicated, but it's annoying. And there is some evidence, and we heard this today, that it is also bad for tree shaking and hence for the performance. So we had two good reasons why we wanted to get rid of barrels. And funnily, we discussed this in this city about a year ago at Angie Bolland last year, when we were sitting together, that we want to get rid of barrels. And yeah, with the next version of Sheriff, and it's already almost done, you can completely work without barrels. That means you don't need to type your exports time and again. You don't need to have those files. What you can do is you can define a special folder name like internal. And if you move something into a folder with this name, then you are not allowed to access it from the outside. And everything else will be public by default. So it's not annoying anymore. And you can change the rules. By default, it's called internal, but you can call it private, or there are ideas to define a club that you say if it starts with an underscore, then it's private. So it's really up to you. And I think it's good for our karma, because yeah, writing those files is not that fun. By the way, if you want to try this all out, then go to your source base and type in those two comments. Then Detective will start up analyzing your code space. You will get all those nice diagrams for your code space. And this is really fun, because it gives you a completely new perspective to your source code. I always have the greatest fun when I'm analyzing source code I've written by myself, but because usually you don't have this perspective, but you say, yeah, it's true, I need to do something here and there. Sometimes you say, yeah, it's a hotspot, but I don't care, it's good enough. So try this out. By the way, if you want to learn more about all those things where we bring together architecture with the implementation you need at the end of the day, check out this free ebook. We meanwhile have 20 chapters. And we also cover, this fits to Matteo's talk, the Signal store in meanwhile 4 chapters. And yeah, it's free here in the 6th edition. So check it out. And a last point of information, we have this modern architecture workshop. We deal with maintainable and modern Angular there. We talk about Sheriff and NX, but also about micro frontends and module federation. So in general, we show you several flavors of how to implement an application that can evolve over time, that can grow over time, so that you can modify something here without breaking something there. We also cover, and this is one of the newest parts in there, signals and the signal store. And yeah, we have it in German and in English. It's fully online and interactive. The English version, by the way, is at the end of this month. So for the English version, you need to hurry a bit. Okay, cool. So let me conclude. What did we see today? We saw that decoupled verticals are a must if you want to have a huge application that can evolve over time. Somehow you need to put it into parts. We have seen that business domains are a good indicator for such a vertical. Not the only one. Team topologies give us further ones, like location on the globe of the development team and so on. But they also say, if possible, go with business domains. You should mirror your team structure. You should have an alignment between your team structure and your architecture, you know, Conway's law. You should think about cognitive load, because we want to have stream-aligned teams that can concentrate on one task. And you should work so that you have a flow and that you can provide business value quite easily. Remove all the showstoppers. And of course, there is a last thing, as always in my presentations. Please remember, good fences make good neighbors. So that's it. Thanks for having me. I have already uploaded. Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice. I have already uploaded my material to my blog. You'll find it here. And follow me on X or on LinkedIn to stay in contact. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfred, for insightful presentation and for a great announcement. And now let's get to the QA session. You already know the rules, so you can raise your hands. Okay, we already have some.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question. I was working with NX for quite a long time. I really liked it. But like 2 years ago, we had to switch to micro frontends due to the issue that we do something here and break something there, right? So is there any recommendation from you if I like NX and I want to avoid such an issue? Like, for example, we want to modify this shared UI library or something like that. And it accidentally breaks something everywhere. We cannot cover it with tests because like it's impossible to cover everything. Like a drop down can become bigger and something is hidden outside of the screen and that's it. So how to avoid such things? Like maybe you know some helpful tricks. Like in our case, we can just scroll back or update something more like granularly. But what to do here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this is really what we focus on. We have a lot of customers with these huge applications where several teams are involved and so on. And first of all, it's about finding the verticals, of course. I assume you have found them. And then the big question is how to implement those verticals. And if it is a large application, you mainly have two big possibilities with some sub-options. But the big possibilities are going with a mono repository or going with micro frontends in different repositories. There is an in-between solution where you have micro frontends in a mono repo, which gives you some advantages from here and there without getting disadvantages from here and there. But in general, regardless of which solution you choose for, you have some disadvantages. If you go with a mono repository, then somehow you need to make sure that your breaking changes are isolated. Having a public and private API can help here. But in this case, as you say, you need to make sure that at least the public API is backwards compatible. So making sure this is always the case can be difficult. Of course, something like code reviews can help, or something like automated tests can help. But there is no 100% solution. Also, if you go with a mono repository, you have a huge advantage. That is, you only have one version, or you can enforce one version, which makes things a bit easier. On the other side, enforcing one version and making all the people to upgrade simultaneously demands a process and demands that people are coordinating with each other. And this is where micro frontends come in with several repositories where you have all the freedom. You can do what you want. You can update your repository when you feel it's the right time. However, it's more complicated now because you have several real applications. You need to build them, to publish them, and to integrate them because your user wants to have the impression of one application. Also, you can end up with having several versions at runtime. Angular in this and that version. You can deal with that, but that's not possible by default. You need to wrap your application somehow, for instance, in web components. Then you have increased bundle sizes. You can also deal with that. So there are also solutions for all those issues. But what I want to say, if you have micro frontends, the complexity is increasing. Not necessarily the complexity of the application itself, but the complexity for integrating everything. And this shows at the end of the day, you need to do an evaluation. You need to find out, I don't say what's best for you, I say what hurts the less. Because you will have some pains every time. And for this reason, some people decide for micro frontends, and some people decide for just one monorepo. Some people decide for something in between. Perhaps one last thought here. NX is really cool, and no one prevents you from using several NX repositories if you really want to have this huge flexibility of having several repos. Very welcome.
Thanks. So I have two questions. The first one is a simple one. Are these tools like Sheriff and Detective available without NX?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the idea. Sheriff and Detective work with and without NX. We really like NX, and we even use NX for implementing Sheriff and Detective. However, we also see that sometimes it's too much. Not everyone has it, not everyone can adopt it. And with those tools, we cover both worlds.
Cool. Yeah, and the second question is, like you showed these verticals, yes, but what in real life we have a lot of cases when business evolves, yes, and some things becoming shared between these verticals, yes, and the biggest pain in such case when you have like 10,000 lines of code for one feature and then someone else from another vertical comes to, okay, we also need this one, but change, I don't know, some drop downs, yes, and this becoming more and more a problem with coupling, yes. How to deal with it?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it really shows that in this case, we are not talking about perfect options. We are always talking about a trade-off. And especially when you're talking about sharing stuff. On the one side, we want to share stuff because we want to be dry. We don't to repeat ourselves because of code duplication and so on. And on the other side, we want to have autonomous teams that are not dependent on other teams, that can work in an autarkic way. And the truth is, we cannot fully have both. So we need to find a good position somewhere in the middle that suits our needs, that is minimizing the pains, because we always have pains. So what I would recommend is to discuss those cases in the team. Perhaps there is an architecture team, or perhaps you can do this with your colleagues that are also affected by it. Usually, I, in general, think that architecture should be in a team, and the architect is the moderator, but it's about everyone bringing in their observations. And then you can decide, well, this time we share it because it's less pain and it's such a complex component. And this time we don't share it because perhaps it just looks like the same now, but perhaps it will evolve into completely different directions over the next month. And then we would end up with a component having an if in every second line of the template, which is also everything but maintainable. So if you say it's a different thing, it just looks the same now, but we mean different things with it. It is the same vocabulary in a different meaning, then perhaps separated. Very welcome. Oh yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is, I have experience in the backend mostly with domain-driven design and modular monolith applications. And in general, the communication in the backend mostly between two modules. It happens through different ways, but the experience that I mostly have is with a pattern called publish and subscribe. And for example, one of the most famous examples are order. Like there is an order module and inventory module. When an order is placed, inventory needs to change.
Yeah.
You need to change something in the inventory. I don't know if this in real life, this kind of example can happen. But if we have a situation that we need to communicate between those two modules, and as far as I understand, the verticals kind of correspond to module, yeah? What are the patterns that we use for communication between two modules?
Yeah, good point. So, as you say, in the backend, something like publish, subscribe, messaging is a good thing. So let's assume the flight is cancelled here, then we also need to cancel the respective boarding. This can be done via messaging in the backend. And very likely this is a case we don't even need to address in the front end, because usually I don't have both windows opened. If I need to address it, then I also need some eventing like WebSockets or something like this. But more usually in the front end are situations where we need to access code from the other side, because we have some functionality in here we also need in the feature there. And then we have several possibilities. One possibility is to move this one into the shared area, the shared kernel, as you would call it in domain-driven design. By saying this, the shared kernel in domain-driven design is about domain-specific things. Here we also talk about sharing technical things. Domain-driven design does not say a thing about technical things, but nevertheless, the shared area would be a good place. Or perhaps you have several shared areas. It does not have to be this one shared area. Another possibility would be to allow this domain access to a very thin part of another domain. This is what you call the open host service in traditional domain-driven design. And here it would just be another barrel file or another sheriff rule that gives us very specific access to a specific part here. Not everything, only a specific part. And another thing, and this really fits nicely to stores and also the signal store, but also Redux, is using eventing in the front end. I can also trigger an event and saying this, the next version of the signal store very likely also gets an eventing layer. I think we've discussed today or yesterday with Marco from the NShareX team on X about this. So eventing is still a thing also in the backend, in the front end.
So you mean that the what is called integration events in the backend for communicating between two modules can be achieved by indirectly?
That's possible. So I would call it a domain event, something like, hey, I've booked a flight or I delayed a flight. I just shoot it out, and if other parts on my page are interested into this very information, they can act accordingly. So it can be done with Redux. It can also be done with a service and behavior subjects, or just subjects.
So I have a question. I really like the detective library, but I believe it does not work without the sheriff library. How hard would it be to migrate from, for example, ethnic plugin boundaries plugin or the NX ecosystem that allows us to make the boundaries between the libraries to the sheriff? Is it a hard process?
It's not a hard process because for sheriff, everything is just a folder. That means, first of all, you can just configure sheriff so that it is using the existing folders as modules. And then as you go, you can refine your configuration so that sheriff is also recognizing subfolders and subfolders as further modules with further access restrictions. So the good thing about sheriff is you can really introduce it incrementally and enforce the rules incrementally.
Okay, I really like that. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks for sharing insights and the good stuff. And I saw good presentation screen that you divide teams or some features by risks. How do you do this?
Teams by releases?
By risks, not by releases. Previous I don't know, presentation screen.
Yeah, it was...
next one? No.
Here.
Yeah. You said that we can divide the features by risks.
Yeah.
And this is quite interesting question.
Oh, yeah. So the main fracture plane is still the business domain. But in some cases, you might do something like this. And dividing by risk is something we might see in applications with a danger zone. So perhaps you have some features that are that dangerous, that are that critical, that you want to have an own team on those features. Perhaps those people are even specialists for risks with regards to business, perhaps laws or other risks, or specialists with regards to computer security, because it's that sensitive. It's nothing you have in a lot of applications, but if you think about banking or insurances, then you might have a highly risky application or sub area, and you want to have perhaps a complicated subsystem team responsible for it that is really hardening this part, making sure no one breaks in there. Sensitive medical information or your wages, stuff like this. Very welcome. But yeah, in some of those cases, I also had to think a lot, and I had to read those chapters several times, because while this guy is here most obvious, some of them are not that obvious and not that often used.
Hello, I have a question about that graph and those layers. What actually is like data layer, and is it more like some business logic layer or infrastructure layer, or what actually is it? And why UI, like those dumb components, can have access to it?
Yeah, interesting question, good question. So what's the data layer and why has UI access to it? Well, here we have the recommendation by the NX team, and I really like to use it as a starter point, because they have a nice in-between between too much and too little. You know, with each and every layer, you are adding some cognitive load and complexity. But you are right, quite often the data layer consists of several aspects. It consists of your model. How is a flight structured? How is a ticket structured? How is a passenger structured? And it consists of services operating on those models, like loading stuff from the backend or saving it to the backend. And sometimes there might be a bit of logic. I mean, the most logic is in the backend, but sometimes we have this kind of logic we also want to have in the front end, something like we cannot have this option and that option together. If you charge you on a monthly basis, we cannot show you the discount possibilities. And we cannot charge you on a monthly, weekly, and yearly basis at the same time. So perhaps a bit of logic is in there, or also perhaps we are delegating this logic to the server. But then also here the logic has the entry point here, and the entry point delegates to the server side. And as you see here, regarding on your situation, you might end up with several aspects in the data layer. And for this reason, some people want to split it up into, let's call it a domain thing that contains domain logic, into a data access thing, and into a model thing, data models. And you're right, if you have an own model library or module, then UI only needs to have access there, but not to data. Because your UI component perhaps needs to know how a flight tickets look alike, but it does not need to know how to load and save the flight ticket. So if you subdivide it, then you don't need to have fully access to everything in this layer from within UI, and you can decide to go with even more layers, sometimes even with more dimensions. Here we have 2 dimensions because it nicely fits on a 2-dimensional PowerPoint slide, but I have also seen products with more dimensions. Then those dimensions are more categories so that they fit your brain.
So for example, like hexagonal architecture inside such a vertical is the solution for that, or not really?
It can be, so it can be. I have even thought if I should talk about it. I have thought it through, but usually I don't talk about it because I have the impression often it's too much. Because what is hexagonal architectures about? The main point of it is about completely separating business logic from infrastructure logic. And if you have a lot of business logic in your client, then this makes sense. But if you mainly delegate via the infrastructure, via HTTP to the server, then hexagonal architectures might be an overkill. But if you have a need for it, if you have a lot of logic, you want to decouple, yeah, then go with it. There are even some reports out there of people doing this, but I think it's rather something you don't need that often because the majority, and I think not the majority, but the vast majority of the business logic is on the server side. But it's a good point, and it's something we also thought through.
Okay, we have also some questions in the chat. So first will be from No Frost. I guess that's a reference to your Fridge anecdote. But anyway, the question is, if we have a larger vertical than our team, are there some good practices on whether we should increase our team size or change the scope of the vertical?
Well, I have the impression quite often it's both, because you cannot increase the team size ever and ever again. I think if you have more than 7, 8 people, then you're reaching this limit. You should not have more. Saying this, I have also seen teams with 12 people that worked nicely together, but as a rule of thumb, 7 plus minus is a good amount of people in a team. So you cannot do this game forever. And when in doubt, perhaps splitting the team is not that bad. I have also seen situations where they refactored out a complicated subsystem of a vertical. And in this case, they had specialist people working on this. So we can actually do both. And it depends a bit on you and the forces in your companies, how to align your source code with your team structure.
Okay, thank you. And one final question from Mateusz. How do backend domains translate to frontend domains?
That's also a perfect question. So I already see we are getting a lot of good questions here, and trust me, this is not the case every time, but this is a perfect question. They align sometimes, and sometimes they are completely different in the backend, because a domain can, or perhaps because we can have a completely different view on the domains from a backend perspective compared to a front-end perspective. The front-end perspective is mainly about the user flow, the user journey. And this does not necessarily fit with what you have in your business and in the brains of your business experts. Let me give you one example from my practice. It's one more time about payroll accountancy, which is quite complicated. You know, a lot of laws, and they are changing all the times. However, we need to keep the code from last year, because if we correct your wages from the last year, we need to align the laws from last year, not from this year. So it's really complicated. And because of this, you might end up with a lot of domains in the backend. From the front-end perspective, it's in most cases quite easy. In most cases, you define who gets which amount of money at the end of which month. And most of the times, you even say, we repeat this for all the further months until he quits or she quits, or we throw them out, something like this. So most of the times, the user journey is quite simple, but behind the covers, a lot of stuff is going on. And this is a good example where the domains don't align. In these cases, I would think about introducing a backend for frontend that is orchestrating several domains for a frontend domain. On the other side, if you are lucky, you have a perfect alignment. If you think about an ERP system with, let's say, financial accounting, and with asset accounting and cost calculation, there you have areas that can be nicely separated. Even more, most financial accountants in bigger companies don't deal a lot with cost calculation, because you have different people for those tasks. And so usually they only see one vertical in the majority of cases. And yeah, in this case, you can align perfectly. And as so often in this ugly world, there are a lot of cases between those two extremities.
Okay, thank you. So we've reached the end of our Q&A session. Thank you again, Manfred, for being today with us.
Thank you.
Okay, it was the final lecture for today, but this doesn't mean the event is over. So we invite all online participants to join online networking session in a minute. And for the people offline, please stay here for the Kahoot quiz. And I have one more big request to all of you. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us. So please take a moment to fill out a short survey about your experience at the event. You will find a QR code in front of you, and also there will be a link in the chat. This really helps us improve and make our future events even better. Our next event will be held online on November 14 at 6 p.m., featuring special guests Alex Okrushko and Jerome Vignon. We also encourage you to follow us on social media to stay updated about all of the events and any other content. And yeah, see you again soon. Thank you.